$450 million. Enough money to transform an agricultural sector, or enough money to make a country dependent on someone else's seeds, fertilizer, machinery, and supply chain for years. That is the question hanging over Burkina Faso in the story now circulating around Ibrahim Traoré. According to that story, Washington was offering a massive agricultural package built around soybeans, equipment, and modernization. For many governments, the answer would sound obvious. Take the money. Take the machinery. Take the deal. But Traoré's political message has been moving in the opposite direction. Produce more at home. Control more at home. Depend less on systems Burkina Faso cannot control. And that turns a simple aid package into something much bigger. Because saying no to foreign assistance can sound powerful. But the real test comes the morning after. Can Burkina Faso produce the seed? Can it secure fertilizer? Can it repair the machines? Can it store the harvest? Can farmers still make money? And can the country replace what it refused to? Because sovereignty is easy to announce. The hard part is building the system that makes it possible. At first glance, the offer looked almost impossible to refuse. $450 million. Seeds, fertilizer, equipment. A modernization package large enough to change the direction of an agricultural sector. For a country facing climate pressure, limited infrastructure, weak mechanization, and the constant challenge of feeding a growing population, the attraction is obvious. But large agricultural deals are never only about the headline number. The real question is what happens underneath it. Who supplies the seed? Who owns the technology? Who services the machinery? Who controls the logistics? Who manages the data? Who sets the conditions when the next planting season begins? That is where the story becomes more complicated. The competitor's version of events claims the proposed package would have relied heavily on American inputs, including imported seeds, fertilizer, equipment, logistics, and agricultural oversight. It also presents GMO seed requirements and U.S.-linked control over parts of the supply chain as central conditions of the package. Those claims need independent verification before they should be treated as established fact. But if terms like those were real, the problem for Burkina Faso would not simply be receiving help. The problem would be what happens after the help arrives. Imagine a farmer receiving improved seed this season. The harvest increases. That looks like success. But next season, what if the farmer still depends on the same external supplier for seed? What if the tractor breaks and the replacement part must come from abroad? What if fertilizer prices rise somewhere else? What if the logistics chain changes up? What if access to agricultural technology data or financing depends on decisions made outside Burkina Faso? Then the country may have gained production without gaining control. And that distinction is everything. Development can increase output without increasing sovereignty. A country can become more productive and still remain vulnerable. That is the contradiction behind Traoré's wider message. Burkina Faso does not simply want more food. It wants more control over the system that produces that food. So the real argument is not foreign help or no foreign help. It is what kind of partnership builds local capability and what kind leaves the country dependent on the next shipment, the next contract, or the next outside decision. The $450 million number may be the headline. The deeper issue is what Burkina Faso would still be able to do when the package ended. A country can import food and still be sovereign. It can import machines and still be sovereign. It can accept foreign financing and still be sovereign. The problem begins when too many critical parts of the system depend on decisions made somewhere else. Start with seed. If farmers cannot reproduce access or replace seed without returning to the same outside supplier, dependence is built into the planting season itself. Then fertilizer. A good harvest may depend on inputs whose price is shaped by global markets, foreign producers, or transport routes. Burkina Faso does not control. Then machinery. A tractor can increase productivity dramatically, but when it breaks sovereignty depends on a much less glamorous question. Can anyone inside the country repair it? Can the spare part be found locally? Can a workshop fabricate something simple if the original component does not arrive? Then logistics. Seed has to move. Fertilizer has to move. Harvests have to reach storage. Processed food has to reach markets. If every critical link depends on one outside network, then one disruption can spread through the entire chain. And then there is data. Modern agriculture increasingly depends on weather information, soil testing, mapping, finance, digital records, and planning systems. Data can improve production, but if a country becomes dependent on systems it cannot inspect, maintain, or replace, a new vulnerability appears. This is why the competitor's framing is emotionally powerful. It reduces the entire problem to one image. Burkina Faso farms the land, but somebody else controls the map. The image is effective even if the factual claims underneath it still require verification. But the structural lesson is broader than America. Replace the United States with France, China, India, Russia, a multinational company, or any single supplier. The problem is the same. If one actor becomes impossible to replace, that actor gains leverage. Self-reliance is therefore not about refusing the world. It is about reducing the number of things your country cannot do without one outside partner. And that is where Traore's message becomes powerful. Not because saying no is brave, but because every no creates a new obligation. Burkina Faso must prove it can build an alternative. Dependence is not defeated by rejection. It is defeated by replacement. Saying no sounds simple. Building what comes after is not. If Burkina Faso rejects a system it believes could deepen dependence, Traore immediately inherits a harder responsibility. He has to show that self-reliance can produce something real. Not applause, not slogans. Food. That is where food sovereignty becomes serious. It means seed that farmers can reliably access. Fertilizer that does not become a national crisis every time global prices move. Machinery that can be maintained. Water that can reach fields when rain does not. Storage that protects a harvest after it leaves the farm. Processing that turns raw crops into products people can actually buy. And markets that give farmers a reason to plant again next season. The competitor's script turns Traore's refusal into a dramatic national moment and repeatedly frames the decision as a rejection of dependence rather than cooperation itself. It even gives Traore lines such as, "We do not reject help, we reject dependence." Whether those exact words were really spoken has to be verified. But the political idea behind them matters. Burkina Faso does not become sovereign simply because it refuses an outside package. It becomes more sovereign only if domestic capacity grows afterward. That changes how Traore's decisions should be judged. The real test is not whether he stood up to Washington. The real test is what Burkina Faso built after saying no. Did local seed systems expand? Did farmers gain better access to machinery? Did irrigation improve? Did processing capacity grow? Did local feed production increase? Did farmers become more productive? And did the country actually reduce something it previously had to import? Every refusal creates a deadline. Sooner or later, the field has to answer the speech. This is where the story becomes much more interesting than a simple confrontation with America. Traore is betting that Burkina Faso can turn political defiance into productive capacity, that a country can move from receiving solutions to building more of its own. And if that transition works, the significance is much larger than one soybean deal. It would mean Burkina Faso had learned something every dependent economy eventually has to learn. Sovereignty is not the freedom to say no. It is the ability to survive what comes after. And that is exactly where the next battle begins. With the farmer. The farmer does not experience sovereignty as a political theory. He experiences it as a season. A bag of seed, a fertilizer bill, a broken machine, a dry field, a harvest waiting for a buyer. That is where every national promise becomes painfully practical. Imagine a farmer in Burkina Faso preparing for the next soybean season. The government says the country must produce more at home. The farmer may agree completely, but agreement does not plant a field. First comes seed. Is there enough? Is it reliable? Can farmers access it on time? Then fertilizer. If the price rises sharply, does planting more still make economic sense? Then water. In the Sahel, one failed rainy period can undo months of planting. Then machinery. A tractor can transform productivity, but if it breaks during planting and no local mechanic can repair it, the machine becomes another form of dependence. Then harvest. Soybeans still have to be dried, stored, moved, processed, and sold. A farmer cannot live on sovereignty alone. He needs income. That is the gap between a political movement and an agricultural system. The competitor script understands this emotionally but often resolves the problem too quickly. It describes farmers shifting toward local seeds cooperatives, expanding and soybean production improving almost automatically after the rejection of foreign aid. Reality is harder. If Burkina Faso wants farmers to produce more soybeans, somebody has to absorb the risk. Who finances the inputs? Who guarantees access to equipment? Who buys the crop if prices fall? Who stores it when the market is full of? Who turns soybeans into animal feed oil, flour, or other products that create more value? And what happens in a bad season? These questions matter because self-reliance cannot survive if the farmer carries all the cost, while the country receives all the symbolism. The farmer has to win too. That means higher productivity, reliable buyers, better storage, lower losses, access to machinery, and enough profit to return to the field next season. This is where Traore's project faces its first real test. Not in Washington, not in a speech, not in a cabinet room, in the field. Because if the farmer cannot make the new system work, the country will eventually return to the old one. And that creates the midpoint question of the entire story. Burkina Faso may be willing to reject dependence, but can it actually replace what it refused? This is the moment when the story has to stop celebrating the refusal and start measuring the replacement. Rejecting a foreign package is one decision. Replacing what that package was supposed to provide is an entire system. Burkina Faso would need seed, fertilizer, farm equipment, repair capacity, storage, processing, credit, and reliable buyers. If even one of those pieces fails, the country can still find itself dependent just on a different bottleneck. That is why the real question is not whether Traore can say no to America. It is whether Burkina Faso can say yes to itself. Yes to local production. Yes to domestic processing. Yes to more Burkinabe-controlled supply chains. Yes to farmers who can stay profitable without waiting for the next foreign program. The competitor's story becomes emotionally strongest here, but also most vulnerable to overstatement. It describes the post-rejection period as if local soybean production cooperatives, seed systems, and feed supply rapidly strengthened across the country. It even suggests that Burkina Faso no longer needed to import soy feed after the first local harvest. That is exactly the kind of claim that has to be tested. Replacing an import is not the same as producing a crop once. The crop has to appear again next season, and the season after that, at a price farmers can afford, at a scale processors can use, with quality buyers can trust, with enough storage to prevent losses, with enough machinery to keep production moving, and with enough local knowledge to fix problems when something breaks. That is when replacement becomes resilience. Imagine two futures. In the first, Burkina Faso rejects foreign agricultural dependence but still imports most of the critical inputs required to run the new system. The flag changes. The dependency does not. In the second, every season builds another layer of domestic capability. More local seed multiplication. More trained mechanics. More processing. More storage. More cooperatives. More buyers. More knowledge inside the country. The difference between those two futures is enormous. Saying no only creates space. Something still has to fill that space. And if Burkina Faso can fill it with a working domestic agricultural system, then the refusal begins to matter. Not as symbolism, as capacity. A soybean field cannot create sovereignty by itself. The real transformation begins after the harvest. Because once the beans leave the farm, Burkina Faso has a choice. Sell them as another raw commodity, or build an economy around them. Imagine the second path. A cooperative collects soybeans from hundreds of farmers. Instead of watching the crop leave the country with most of its potential value still unrealized, the beans move toward a local processing plant. There, one harvest begins splitting into several products: soybean oil, animal feed, flour, food ingredients. Products that households, livestock producers, farmers, and local businesses can actually use. Suddenly, the soybean is doing more than feeding people. It is creating another layer of the economy. But every new layer creates another challenge. The cooperative needs storage. The processor needs electricity. The factory needs machinery. The machinery needs spare parts. The trucks need roads. The farmers need financing. And the finished product needs customers. This is where self-reliance stops being one agricultural policy and becomes a national system. There is little value in producing more soybeans if they rot before reaching a processor. There is little value in building a processing plant if unreliable power keeps shutting it down. And there is little sovereignty in owning the factory if every serious mechanical failure still requires someone thousands of kilometers away to fix it. A national system has to connect every link. Farmer, cooperative, storage, transport, processing, energy, market, repair, finance. Break one link and pressure moves into the next. Strengthen all of them and something larger begins to happen. Burkina Faso stops asking only how much can we grow and starts asking how much of the entire chain can we control. That is the question that could turn soybeans from a crop into economic infrastructure. And if Burkina Faso can prove the model works, the consequences would not stop at its borders, because Mali is watching. Niger is watching. Other countries across the Sahel are watching. Not because every government wants to copy Traore, and not because every country faces exactly the same agricultural problem, but because the question underneath this story is bigger than soybeans. Can an African country reduce dependence without isolating itself? Can it accept useful partnerships without becoming trapped by them? Can it build enough domestic capacity that foreign support becomes an option instead of a necessity? Those questions exist anywhere a country grows raw materials imports, finished products depends on outside technology, or struggles to process more of its own resources at home. The competitor script repeatedly expands the story from Burkina Faso to the wider continent. It presents Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and other African actors as reacting to Burkina Faso's example, turning one national decision into a regional movement. That escalation is powerful. But the stronger version of the story is not that Africa copies Traore. It is that Africa watches to see whether the model actually works. Because if Burkina Faso can increase local seed capacity, expand processing, reduce critical imports, keep farmers profitable, and build a supply chain that survives without constant external rescue, then other countries suddenly have something more valuable than a slogan. Evidence. And evidence travels. That is how a national experiment becomes a regional idea. Not through applause, through imitation of what actually works. And that creates a new layer of tension. Because if Burkina Faso succeeds, outside powers do not simply lose influence over one country. They may face a region with more options, more local production, more diversified partners, more domestic capability, and less willingness to accept deals simply because there is no alternative. If Burkina Faso succeeds, the West does not suddenly lose Africa. That would be too simple. But outside powers could lose something more subtle: leverage. Influence is strongest when one side has fewer alternatives. If farmers depend on imported seed, the supplier matters. If processing equipment comes from one country, that country matters. If financing, logistics, agricultural data, and technical support all come from the same network, that network gains weight far beyond the original transaction. None of that automatically makes a partnership exploitative, but it does mean economic relationships can become political relationships. And if Burkina Faso begins building more domestic capacity, the balance changes. A seed supplier that once had no serious competitor may face local alternatives. A foreign processor may have to compete with a Burkinabe plant. A development partner may have to offer better terms because Burkina Faso has another option. A country with more choices can negotiate harder. The competitor script goes further, presenting U.S. soft power as already threatened and suggesting major economic consequences for American agribusiness. Those claims require verification before they should be treated as fact. But the strategic question remains powerful. What happens when a country that once depended on one outside system begins building alternatives? Foreign partners do not disappear. They have to compete. And that may be the most important shift of all. Self-reliance does not necessarily close the door to the West. It changes the terms on which the West enters. But self-reliance also has a price. It sounds powerful when spoken from a podium. It becomes harder when families have to pay for it. Building domestic capacity is not free. A local seed system needs research. Processing plants need capital. Warehouses need construction. Irrigation needs water infrastructure. Machines need fuel, electricity, spare parts, and trained technicians. And while all of that is being built, imported products may still be cheaper. That creates the most dangerous stage of the transition. Burkina Faso can be politically determined to reduce dependence and still discover that domestic production costs more. Farmers may face higher input prices. Processors may struggle with unreliable power. Consumers may see food prices rise before local supply becomes large enough. The competitor script briefly acknowledges this kind of pressure. It mentions inflation, shortages of cooking oil and animal feed, and warnings that the transition could create a food crisis. That tension matters. Sovereignty that only works when prices are low is fragile. A successful self-reliance strategy has to survive bad seasons too. Drought, equipment failure, commodity price shocks, political mistakes, corruption, weak management, a failed harvest, and the temptation to protect inefficient industries forever. That last risk matters. A government can protect a local producer from foreign competition, but protection should create time to become stronger. If it creates permanent inefficiency, instead consumers end up paying the price. So the real question is not simply whether Burkina Faso can replace foreign suppliers. It is whether domestic alternatives can eventually become reliable, productive, and competitive. Can farmers produce more without becoming poorer? Can processors operate without permanent subsidies? Can locally produced feed compete on price and quality? Can machines stay running after the cameras leave? Can infrastructure still work 5 years later? Can corruption be controlled when more money moves through state-supported projects? These questions are not attacks on the self-reliance project. They are the conditions that determine whether it succeeds. Because failure would not prove that Burkina Faso should remain dependent. It would prove that sovereignty requires more than intention. It requires execution. And that brings us to the only fair way to judge the experiment. Not by applause. Not by speeches. Not by how angry Washington becomes. By the numbers. So how do we know whether Burkina Faso is actually becoming more self-reliant? Start with soybean output. Does domestic production rise from one season to the next? Then seed. Can farmers access reliable seed locally, or do they still depend heavily on outside suppliers? Then fertilizer. Has Burkina Faso reduced one of its most dangerous input vulnerabilities, or does every global price shock still reach the farmer immediately? Then machinery. Are tractors and processing equipment staying operational? Can local technicians repair them? Can spare parts be sourced or fabricated without waiting for a foreign shipment? Then storage. How much of the harvest is protected instead of lost? Then processing. Are soybeans being turned into oil feed flour and other products inside Burkina Faso? Or is the country still exporting raw value and importing finished value? Then the market. Are farmers finding buyers? Are processors competitive? Are consumers able to afford the final product? And then comes the most important measure of all. Imports. If Burkina Faso says it is becoming more self-reliant, then over time the country should need less of something it previously had to buy from abroad. That is where rhetoric becomes measurable. More local production, more domestic processing, lower import dependence, higher farmer incomes, lower post-harvest losses, better machinery uptime, more reliable access to inputs, stable or improving food affordability. If those indicators improve year after year, then Traore's self-reliance project has evidence behind it. If they do not, then the movement may still have powerful symbolism. But symbolism is not a supply chain. That is why this story should not end with Washington. It should end in Burkina Faso. In the field, in the warehouse, in the processing plant, in the market. Because the real question is no longer whether Traore can reject an outside system. It is whether Burkina Faso can build a better one. And if it can, saying no was never the most important part of the story. Building yes was. Burkina Faso does not prove sovereignty by rejecting America. It proves sovereignty by building enough at home that rejection no longer creates a crisis. That means stronger farmers, reliable seed, working machinery, storage that protects the harvest, Processing that keeps more value inside the country, and markets that allow local production to survive without permanent protection. If Traore's strategy succeeds, the biggest change will not be a speech in Ouagadougou or a reaction in Washington. It will be something quieter. A farmer planting without waiting for a foreign shipment. A technician repairing a machine locally. A processor buying Burkina Faso soybeans. A country discovering that it has another option. That is the real promise of self-reliance, not isolation. Choice. Reducing dependence does not mean eliminating trade. No modern economy produces everything it consumes, and Burkina Faso does not need to. The stronger goal is diversification, more local capability, where it matters most, more than one external supplier where imports remain necessary, and enough domestic knowledge to negotiate from a position of choice rather than urgency. So if Burkina Faso had to invest in one thing first to make this system stronger, what should it be? Seed irrigation machinery, processing, or storage? Tell me where you are watching from and why. Because sovereignty becomes real when a country can build the alternative it once had to import. Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.